Hi, so a couple of weeks ago I made a video on the essentials of the Cubase 13 chord track, and in the comments of that video many of you also asked for a more advanced video on the features, so this is that video. So let's go! Now in that earlier video about the Cubase 13 chord pads, I really dove into the essentials of the chord pads. So if you're not aware of the basic functionality of the Cubase chord pads, please check out that video first. Now I will link it up here so you can check it out first, if you promise to come back to this video for the more advanced features, okay? So let's dive right into Cubase to check out the player functionality that these chord pads provide. So this is a pretty empty Cubase project in which I have a chord track, I have a track with a piano virtual instrument just on Heli and Sonic, and I have a track with a guitar virtual instrument. And in the lower zone over here I have enabled the chord pads. Now all the chord pads are loaded with the chords from the default preset over here, and the chord pads are connected to my MIDI keyboard back here. So let's quickly have a listen. Yeah, so the basic setup is working. Now in the top toolbar of the chord pad zone over here, you can see that I currently have selected the piano player, and you have an option of selecting different players here. Now the reason for being able to select different players is because on different instruments and even for different music styles played on that instrument, the voicings of the chords that a musician will play will probably not be the same. For example, if I play the C minor here for the piano player, you see over here on the keyboard that it's a pretty wide voicing. Now a guitar player, for example, will typically not play this voicing. So if I select the guitar track, you can hear that same voicing that a piano player would play on a guitar. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but you can also change the player in Cubase. And that's what you can do with that menu over here. For example, for this guitar track, I might want to select the guitar player. So if I now play the C minor here, you can see that the voicing will change as well. So these voicings are a bit more like a guitar player would play them, and they're remembered for each track, as long as you have the record mode enabled on the track when you set the correct player or the monitoring button over here. So right now the guitar track will play guitar voicings, and the piano track will play piano player voicings. Now, like I said, the chord voicing that is played may also depend on the style. So when you select the piano player over here, you can also select a chord voicing style. They have a couple of different styles: rock, easy jazz, altered jazz, and you can even customize the voicings by specifying what kind of chords you want that player to play. 5-note chords, 4-note chords, chords with major ninth, specify some root note options for the chords, specify what the range of the voicing should be. So you can customize quite a bit for each player, and all of that is remembered by Cubase per track that you have the player enabled for. For example, if I switch to the guitar track over here, you see that I now get the guitar player, like I said earlier, and there are some other chord voicing styles available for the guitar player. 3-string triads, modern jazz, and again, you have some customizations. Fewer than for a piano player, but you can customize them. Now if you want to have two guitar player tracks where one guitar player is playing certain voicings and the other guitar player is playing other voicings, that's also possible because you can actually add a player over here. For example, add a guitar player, then we get guitar player 2, and we can, for example, set him to be a modern jazz player. And the initial guitar player is maybe still a guitar player for 3-string triads. So you can now switch between these two players, and you can link them to two different guitar virtual instrument tracks in your project. So the next option for a player is that you can also influence what he plays and how he plays this. Because right now the player mode over here is set to plain chords, but you can, for example, also determine what happens if the chords overlap. Now hold first means that it holds the notes of the first chord and no note off message is sent. But if the chords have common notes, these are not triggered again on the second chord. So let me demonstrate that. So both chords played at the same time. Legato means that the notes of the first chord are released, except for the common notes. These are held and not triggered again. And stop first means that all notes of the first chord are released, so they're not held even if they are the same notes as in the first chord. Let's switch back to the piano sound over here. And the last setting determines whether you want to filter out any notes that you have. Right now no notes are filtered out, so I can, for example, also play higher up on the keyboard. Of course, no chords are played because it doesn't fall in the chord triggering blue zone over here, but you can still play those notes. However, if you want to avoid that, you can also set it to filter notes from MIDI through. And that means you will only hear a chord when you trigger chord pads with one of the chord pad keys and not when you play any of the other keys. Now, apart from playing chords, these players can also play patterns by selecting this option. And right now this pattern is set to the default pattern over here, which is a pattern of 8 bars in 4/4 time. So let's see what this sounds like. Quite nice, but you have a lot of presets over here. And I'm aware that some of these kind of disappear below your screen, but let's focus on the ones that you can see, because these are currently in my user presets apparently, and they are called earlier presets. So I assume they're from an earlier version of Cubase, but over here are also the newer presets. So let's, for example, choose this epic piano ballad, length of 2 bars. Now what you also may see is that in the chord pad you see a little progress bar which shows you how far the pattern is. Now that is something that you do need to enable in the settings over here. Let me shift this a little bit so you can actually see the settings. So over here there's a setting to show the pattern play progress, which needs to be enabled to see that progress bar in the chord pad. Now you can also set whether the pattern gets the velocity of the played notes from the keyboard or from the pattern. So if you set it to keyboard, you can determine how hard the pattern is played by how hard you press the key on your keyboard. And if you set this to pattern, then it doesn't really matter how loud you play your keys, because it uses the velocity which is embedded in the pattern. Now, apart from selecting one of the presets over here, you can also import a MIDI loop. This will bring up the media bay and show you some of the MIDI loop which are part of Cubase, but you can also import your own if you want to. For example, let's import a jazz MIDI loop, maybe this one. See what that sounds like. Length of 4 bars. Yeah, so an entirely different pattern again. So you can also add your own MIDI patterns to the media bay, or even just drag them on top of the pattern control over here in order to use the pattern from your MIDI file in the chord pad. Now in our previous video I showed you that you can also drag chord pads onto a MIDI track so that the chord would be available on that MIDI track, but unfortunately that does not work with patterns. For example, if I now drag this E flat to my piano track, you can see that this is just an E flat chord without the actual pattern embedded. So if you want to have the patterns available as MIDI, you will have to record them like this. And now you have the pattern available as MIDI and you can change it as you'd like for your song. Yeah, so those players and the patterns that they can play are really useful. You don't have to play just plain chords, but you can probably find one of the preset patterns which works very well for you, or maybe even import your own MIDI pattern that you downloaded from somewhere or played somewhere else. Now those players and any settings that you make can also be saved as a preset within the regular preset menu over here. However, if you want to load chords plus players and their settings, you have to make sure that you set this load preset setting, load chords and players, and not, for example, load chords only or load presets only. So that the full set of what you configured is actually loaded from the preset. Now, if by now you like this video or find it useful, please give it a big thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm so that it gets shown to more people. Subscribe to the channel, and you can also ring the little bell icon if you want to get notified when I publish another video. If you really like my videos, you can also show your appreciation via the virtual tip jar, which is the super thanks button below, or by using any of the affiliate links in the description to one of these stores. If you're going to buy something at those stores anyway, just click one of those links first and I will get a small commission of whatever you buy without any additional cost to you. So it's a win-win if you want to show your support. But let's now dive into the third option that you have for what a player plays. We saw plain chords, we saw patterns, but it's also possible for a player to play sections. And that's sometimes a bit of a hard to understand concept, because initially what I thought is that it had to do with sections of an orchestra maybe. If you read the description in the manual, you may think that you can assign different notes of the chords to different sections of an orchestra, but that's not actually the way it works. Because in the Cubase manual it says that sections allows you to play back single notes or groups of notes, so-called sections, of the chords that are assigned to the chord pads. Sections contain the chord notes starting from bottom to top. So the first section represents the lowest note or part of a chord, usually the bass. The second section represents the next notes up, and so on. So let's check out what this looks like in Cubase. And you can again set that in the player mode over here. And then you select sections. And you may have noticed that now that I have selected sections, there are 4 notes over here, which are in a brownish sort of color. And those now represent the individual sections of the selected chord on the chord pad. And there are section player settings. They are now default. And that basically means that in order to play a note from a chord, you have to first play the note on your keyboard that represents the chord. And then with the section keys, you can play individual notes from that chord. So let's have a look how this works. I'm first playing my C minor chord on my keyboard here. But as you can tell, that does not play a sound, because in order to play the sound, you have to play the notes from the sections. You can play them all at the same time, which means that you're just playing the chord, but you can also play them one at a time. Or play only part of the notes of the chord. So this provides you with another way that you can play the individual notes of the chord in a sort of pattern, but you can make it up by yourself as you go along. Now again, you can specify what happens on overlaps of notes, and you can filter out the notes below and above the chord pad keys. But there's also a section player settings. It's now set to default, but you can also customize that. And right now the default is sections with latch chord pads. And that basically means that you first have to play the note which indicates the chord that you want to play, and then you can play one of the section keys. And latch even means that you don't have to hold the note of the chord. So for example, you can also do this. So I was not holding the C or D key there to play the C minor and G minor chord. I just played it once to indicate which chord I wanted to play, and then with the section keys I could play the individual notes. Now you can also set this to work the other way around, which means that you first need to play a section note and only then indicate which chord you want to play. For example, I can say I want to play the root note of the chord and only then indicate from which chord. Or I can play the second note of the chord and then indicate from which chord. Or you can set this to combination, and then it doesn't really matter which note you play first. You can either start with a key on the keyboard that triggers one of the chord pads, or you can start with the key on the keyboard that triggers one of the section notes. Now over here you can also configure how the notes of the chords are distributed over the various sections. For example, distribute additional notes starting at last section means that when you have a chord which has more than 4 notes, because you only have 4 sections at the moment, then when you play the last section key, it will play all the other notes of the chord, which for example applies for this F major 7-9, which has 5 notes in its voicing. So those notes will actually play like this. I first trigger the chord. So the first 3 section keys trigger 1 note each, and then the last section key will trigger the remaining 2 notes of the chord. You can also set that the first section key will trigger all the additional notes, and you can also force the player to always use single notes for the first section, the last section, or both, in which case the additional notes are distributed in another way again. You can also mute certain sections. For example, if you mute the first section, then typically the bass note of the chord will not be played when you play the section keys. And to make it even more complex, there are also so-called subsections, which allow you to define extra keys on your keyboard, which will again play certain notes based on the selected chord. Let me quickly show you that as well, because this is really an advanced feature. Because for that you first need to set up the player remote control in the Chord Pads remote settings. And over here you can also see that these are the keys which we have defined as section keys, the brown keys here basically. You could have a fifth one if you really wanted to, but you can also set up a subsection key. Let's for example take the next one in line, G3. It colors a bit light green here now on the keyboard, as you can see. And if we now go to the custom section player settings, you can see that we now have a subsection 1 which is triggered by that G3 key, and we can assign it to whatever is in section 1, and we can say, okay, if we play that key, we want to play a note 12 semitones higher, for example. So that G3 key will now play the same note as in the section 1 key, but then an octave higher. So yet one more option to play certain patterns with the chord pads. Now hang in there, we're almost there, so let's tie up some loose ends related to chord pads. For example, what I haven't talked about yet is that you can also determine what you see over here in these two toolbars of the chord pad zone. If you right click, you can see that you can set up the main toolbar, and basically everything is enabled by default apart from the chord assistant window and the snap playback to musical grid. Now the chord assistant provides you with a separate chord assistant window. It's very similar to what you get here in the right zone. The only thing is that you also get a proximity chord assistant, which gives you yet another view in relation to what chords are close to the currently selected chord on the chord pads. And again, this gives you a way to assign certain chords to the chord pad. For example, you can drag it over here and assign it to a chord pad by dropping it. And the other option that we enabled in the toolbar here is to snap playback to the musical grid. So whenever you play these chord pads, it will assure that they start and end on one of these note values, which is important, for example, if you're playing patterns. Now for another set of options, I need to make this window a bit smaller again, because I want to show you these settings, which are the chord pads display settings. And that basically determines what will be shown on the chord pad. Right now, the primary thing that is shown on the chord pad is the note name, right? C minor, E flat, A flat 7. You can also set a secondary type, for example, a Roman numeral, so that you can see the function of the chord within the selected key over here, or even the Nashville numbering system, which is pretty much the same, but it uses regular numbers instead of Roman numerals. And if you want to, you can also just show that for the primary type instead of the regular note names. Currently the chord pad layout is set to keyboard, so that you can easily play them on a MIDI keyboard, but you can also set it to grid mode, which gives them a more rectangular layout, and then you can even change the number of columns and rows to a maximum of 64 chord pads. So that's quite a lot if you need all of those in one song. But let's set it back to keyboard mode. Then you have some options to show the list assistant colors on the chord pads, which indicate which chords provide a smooth transition and which chords provide a more adventurous transition if you choose them next. You can choose to enable or disable the voicing indicators. This will enable or display showing the progress bar when you play a pattern. Now finally, we have the chord pad remote settings over here, which we already shortly looked at when we had a look at the player remote control for defining the section keys and the subsection keys. Now you can define yet more keys, which allows you to set up certain keys on your MIDI keyboard that can control whether you want to mute or unmute a certain player. This is, for example, important if you have multiple players in your project which all play different things at the same time. Then it is possible that you mute or unmute those players with the keys on your MIDI keyboard for certain sections. For example, when you're playing live with these chord pads, you can mute a certain player during the verse and unmute him again during the chorus, all with the click of a keyboard key. Now you also have the pad remote control section over here, and this allows you to set the MIDI inputs that your chord pads are listening to. Over here as well you can set that you want to latch the chords, so that when you play the trigger note on your MIDI keyboard for a certain chord, you don't need to hold it, you just have to play it once and then the chord is held basically. You can also set which range on the keyboard triggers your chord pad. So now it's, for example, set from C1 to D sharp 2, from this blue key to this blue key over here. But I can lower that and extend the range of blue keys. You also have chord modifier keys, which are the green keys down below here. You can activate them or deactivate them. And these basically allow you to modify the chord voicings in the same way that the toolbar keys over here did. So a lot of ways to control these chord pads with your MIDI keyboard if that's important to you. So let me know, did you know all these advanced options already and are you using them? If so, do you have any creative uses for them? Let us know in the comments so that we can all learn from that as well. And if you really like these deep dives into Cubase functionality, I have a whole playlist with Cubase related videos over here. So check it out, enjoy, and see you soon.